The prodigy called me Grandma. He stood over me at the grand piano, his smile sharp and cruel. In front of the entire opulent gala, he laughed and said my simple song was cute, but I should leave the music to the professionals. He pushed me aside to play something loud and flashy. He didn't know that the simple song I was playing was the one I had written. He didn't know that the guest of honor, the world-famous Maestro Anton Volkov, was the student I had taught it to, and he had no idea that Maestro Volkov had been searching for me, his lost Maestra, for 30 years. My hands don't look like mine anymore. The skin is thin, stretched tight over every knuckle and ropey blue vein. They shake just a little all the time. It is the one thing I cannot control. These hands, which were once my entire life, are now just two old spotted things that struggle with buttons. I live at the Rosewood Gardens retirement home. The name sounds lovely. The reality is the smell of bleach and the constant, dull sound of a television blaring game shows in the common room. I was sitting in my armchair, watching dust move in the beam of afternoon light, when Jenny, one of the young aides, bustled into my room. She never knocks. "Alara? You've got mail." Her voice was loud and bright, the way people talk to small children or pets. My goodness, look at this one. It's so heavy. She handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope. It felt important. My name, Ms. Alara Vance, was written across the front in sweeping dark gold ink. My stiff fingers struggled with the wax seal. Inside, the cardstock was even thicker. "The St. Jude's Foundation Annual Charity Gala," I read aloud. My voice was rusty. "Oh, that," Jenny said, straightening the blanket on my bed that was already straight. "They send those to all the residents. The foundation gives money to Rosewood, so it's a courtesy." "A courtesy," I repeated. "Of course nobody actually goes," she laughed, as if the idea was ridiculous. "It's $100 a plate dinner. Can you imagine? Plus, it's all the way downtown at the Grand Mark Hotel." I stared at the invitation. The Grand Mark. I knew the Grand Mark. I remembered the heavy glass doors, the acres of marble, and the crystal chandeliers that looked like frozen waterfalls. I remembered the sound 1,000 people made, clapping in its grand ballroom. I turned the card over. Jenny was still talking, something about the new dinner menu, but her voice faded. My thumb tapped out a quiet rhythm on the arm of the chair. A simple melody, just 5 notes. A little tune I'd used to quiet a restless, angry boy so many years ago. "That's a sweet little tune, Alara," Jenny said, her attention caught. "Did you make it up?" "It's just something I remember," I said. "It's very simple. I like it." She smiled, then looked at her watch. "Well, time for Mrs. Petrov's medicine. You let me know if you need anything, dear." I was alone again. I looked back at the invitation. At the bottom, in small, precise type, was the program schedule. Welcome address, dinner, silent auction, and then a line that made the air leave my lungs. Special guest of honor and keynote speaker, Maestro Anton Volkov. Anton. The world tilted. Anton, my Anton. The furious, brilliant, starving boy I had found in a drafty Warsaw orphanage. The one who listened to a broken piano as if it were the voice of God. The boy I had taught. The boy I had lost. He was a maestro now, world famous. I had seen his name, of course, on newspapers and in magazines for 20 years. But I had never seen him. I was the one who hid. I was the one who disappeared, who let the world think I was gone. Mabel from 2B rolled past my door in her walker, her slippers shuffling on the linoleum. "What's that, Alara?" "An invitation?" Her voice was like gravel. "Don't tell me you're going to the ball, Cinderella. What will you wear? Your good house coat?" I stared at Anton's name. After 30 years. He was here. In this city, a strange cold energy moved down my arms. It wasn't a spark, not a feeling of joy. It was a sense of weight, of something heavy that I had to see through to the end. "Jenny?" I called out, my voice stronger now. She popped her head back around the doorframe. "Yes, Ilara. I will need someone to press my black dress. The one in the garment bag at the back of the closet." Jenny's mouth fell open. Mabel stopped her walker. "And please," I said, folding the invitation and placing it on my nightstand, "I will need to arrange a taxi for Saturday night." My black dress was plain, wool, with long sleeves. It was more appropriate for a funeral than a gala. It was the only thing I owned that wasn't a knit sweater or a pair of elastic waist pants. I had kept it in a vinyl garment bag for 20 years. It smelled faintly of cedar. When the taxi arrived, Jenny helped me into the lobby. She had done my hair, pulling it back into a simple, tight bun that made my scalp feel stretched. "Are you absolutely sure, Ilara?" she whispered, adjusting my thin coat over my shoulders. "It's going to be a late night." Mabel was there, clutching her walker. "Look at her," Mabel cackled. "Going to see the king," I didn't answer. I just walked, one slow step at a time, out the automatic doors and into the cold night air. The taxi driver held the back door for me, his face impassive. The drive downtown was a blur of streetlights. The city had changed so much. The buildings were taller, brighter. I felt like a ghost, moving through a world that no longer belonged to me. My hands were folded in my lap, and I could feel the tremor in my fingers against the wool of my dress. The Grand Mark Hotel was just as I remembered, only more so. It loomed over the street, all stone and light. A river of people in tuxedos and sparkling gowns flowed up the wide carpeted steps. Our taxi was a small yellow boat in a sea of long black cars. The driver had to help me out. I stood for a moment on the sidewalk, a small, frail woman in a plain black coat. People streamed around me, a tide of loud voices, sharp laughter, and the overwhelming scent of perfume. No one looked at me, or rather, they looked through me. I clutched my small, worn purse and walked inside. The ballroom was enormous. I had forgotten. The ceiling was 3 stories high, and the chandeliers hung down, dripping with thousands of crystal points that shattered the light. The noise was the first thing that hit me, a solid wall of human chatter. Hundreds of voices bouncing off the marble and glass. Tables covered in white linen and elaborate flower arrangements stretched out in every direction. Waiters in stiff white jackets moved between them, carrying trays of champagne. I gave my name at the door. The young woman with the list frowned, tapping at her tablet. "Vance? Ilara Vance?" Her eyes scanned. "Ah, yes, Rosewood Gardens. Table 42. She pointed vaguely toward the back. "It's over there, by the service entrance." I walked, my old shoes silent on the thick carpet. It felt like walking a mile. The closer I got to the back, the dimmer the lights became. Table 42 was, as she said, pressed against a wall next to a large, rubber-gasketed door that servers kept bursting through. The table was empty. A small sign in the middle said, "Rosewood Gardens." Of course, Jenny was right. No one else had come. I sat down, my back to the wall. From here I was invisible. I could see the whole room, a glittering spectacle of wealth and power. I watched the people. They were all so young, so confident, their faces smooth and their laughter easy. My eyes searched the crowd. I was looking for a face I hadn't seen since it was a boy's. I was looking for Anton. He wasn't here. Not yet. The main stage was low, draped in black velvet, and in the center of it, sitting under a set of spotlights, was the piano. It was a Bösendorfer. A full concert grand. The polished black lid was propped open, reflecting the chandeliers above. It was a beautiful, powerful thing. It looked like it was waiting for the evening's star, the young prodigy they had mentioned in the program. My hands, resting on my lap, suddenly felt cold. My fingers twitched, tapping out that old 5-note pattern against my leg. Dinner began. Waiters brought plates of food I didn't recognize. The noise level rose. Men laughed loudly, their voices booming. Women's jewelry clicked and chimed. A man at the table next to mine was telling a long, boring story about the stock market, his voice drowning out everything else. I sat alone at table 42, an island in the middle of the noise. I hadn't touched my food. My gaze kept returning to the stage, to the dark, silent shape of the Bösendorfer. It was beautiful. It looked patient. No one was paying any attention to it. The stage was just a piece of furniture at the end of the room. My heart was doing a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. My hands were shaking more than usual. I picked up my water glass, and the water shivered. I put it down. I felt a pull, a magnetic, undeniable need to just touch it. I hadn't put my hands on a real concert grand in 30 years, not since I walked away from my old life. Slowly, using the table for support, I stood up. My knees ached. I smoothed the front of my black dress. I began to walk. No one noticed. I was just an old woman in a plain dress, moving through the shadows at the edge of the room. I slipped between tables, past a large potted palm, and found myself at the low, carpeted steps to the stage. I took them one at a time. My shoes made no sound. The stage was its own world. The air up here felt different, clearer. The light from the spotlights was warm on my face. The piano was even larger than it looked from the floor. I ran my fingers along the polished wood. It was smooth as glass. I sat down on the edge of the bench. It was the perfect height. My hands hovered over the keys, trembling. I looked out. The ballroom was a glittering, noisy blur. Hundreds of people eating, drinking, and talking, all unaware of me. I placed my fingers on the keys. They were cool. I pressed down. A single, clear note rang out. It was almost lost in the noise, but I heard it. I played another, then another. I closed my eyes. Quietly, so quietly it was almost just for myself, I began to play. The 5-note melody, the lullaby, the one I had taught Anton. My fingers were stiff, the joints ached, but they remembered. The music came out, simple and pure. For a moment I wasn't at the gala. I wasn't a Laura from Rosewood. I was myself again. A hymn. The sound was sharp, right beside my ear. My eyes snapped open. A young man stood over me, looking down his nose. He was tall, dressed in a tuxedo that looked like it was sewn onto him. His dark hair was slicked back, not a single strand out of place. This had to be the star, Julian Vale. He smiled, but it was not a kind smile. It was all teeth. "Grandma," he said. His voice was loud, cutting through my playing. The people at the nearest tables turned to look. "Your simple songs are cute." My face grew hot. I tried to pull my hands away, but he put his own hand on the high keys, caging me in. "But please," he continued, his smile widening, "leave the music to the professionals." A few people at the front table laughed. "It's just a warm-up." "You see," Julian said to the small audience he had gathered. He deftly slid onto the bench, his body physically pushing me off the seat and forcing me to stand. I stumbled back a step. "We need to prepare the piano for some real music." Without another look at me, he launched into a furious piece of music. It was Liszt. It was all noise and speed. His fingers flew across the keys, a frantic, pounding assault. He was technically perfect. Every note was precise. Every run was clear. But there was nothing else. It was hollow. It was just loud. The crowd loved it. People stood up, pulling out their phones to record him. He was a spectacle, all flying hands and dramatic poses. He was playing for their eyes, not their ears. I stood to the side, pushed away, completely invisible once more. My hands were balled into fists, my knuckles white. Julian finished with a final crashing chord that seemed to shake the entire room. The applause was immediate and deafening. He stood up, soaking it in, and took a deep, theatrical bow. As he rose from his bow, the main ballroom doors swung open. A hush fell. Julian's smile froze as he and everyone else turned to see who had arrived. The man in the doorway was Anton. I knew it instantly. He was older, of course. His dark hair was cut short and streaked with gray at the temples. His face was leaner, harder, and lined with a weariness I did not recognize. But the eyes were the same, dark, intense, and carrying a deep, familiar sadness. He was Maestro Anton Volkov. He wore a simple black suit, severe and perfect. He looked entirely bored. Julian Vale, still flushed from his performance, recovered first. He smoothed the front of his jacket and beamed. "Maestro Volkov, an honor!" Anton gave a curt nod, his gaze sweeping the room with a practiced indifference. He started to walk, not toward the stage, but toward the head table set at the front. Julian, seeing his moment of glory being ignored, looked annoyed. He glanced from the retreating maestro back to me. A cruel, sharp light came into his eyes. He saw a new way to get the spotlight back. "Oh, and Maestro," Julian called out, his voice sharp and loud. Anton stopped. He turned, his expression impatient. "You must hear this," Julian said, gesturing to me with a grand, mocking sweep of his hand. "Our guest," he practically spat the word, "was just playing the most charming little tune. Show him, Grandma. A nice, simple welcome. He was using me. He was painting me as a joke to get the great man's attention." The room was silent, watching this strange, uncomfortable play. Julian smiled, waiting for the laughter. My face was burning. I wanted to turn and walk away, to disappear back to table 42, back to Rosewood. But I was trapped in the spotlight. Julian gestured to the piano bench again. "Go on," I looked at him. Then I looked at the keys. They were my oldest friends. They had never lied to me. My hands were trembling so hard I could barely control them. But I sat. I took one steadying breath, ignoring the sneer on Julian's face. I ignored the hundreds of watching, curious eyes. I ignored the impatient stare of Anton Volkov. I placed my fingers on the keys, and I began to play my simple song again. I played only 4 bars. Just the first phrase, "Stop." The word was not a shout. It was a low, desperate command that cut through the entire ballroom. I stopped. My fingers froze on the keys. I looked up. Anton Volkov, who had been 50 feet away, was now completely still. His face, moments ago bored and severe, was suddenly white. His eyes were wide, locked on me. He looked as if he had been struck. Julian stepped forward, his smile fading. "Maestro, is something wrong?" "It's just, Volkov moved. He pushed past Julian, shoving the young pianist so hard that Julian stumbled back against the piano, his face blank with shock. Anton's eyes never left mine. He wasn't walking. He was moving fast, weaving between the tables, his face fixed on me. The guests pulled their chairs back, startled. He reached the stage. He didn't use the stairs. He put one hand on the low platform and vaulted himself up. The entire gala, hundreds of people, was utterly silent. The only sound was the clink of ice in a glass. Anton stood in front of me, breathing hard. He stared at my face, his own working with emotions I could not read. He looked pained, confused, and filled with a sudden, wild hope, and then, in front of everyone, the world-famous Maestro Anton Volkov dropped to his knees on the marble floor. A woman in the front row gasped. He reached out, his hand shaking, and seized my left hand. His grip was strong, almost painful. He looked up at me, his eyes searching my face. They were filling with tears. "Maestra?" he choked out. The word was a whisper, rough and full of disbelief. "Maestra, is it you?" I stopped breathing. "We thought you were gone," he whispered, his voice breaking. We thought you were gone forever." He just knelt there, clutching my hand, his face wet with tears, waiting for me to answer. I looked down at the famous, powerful man kneeling on the floor, clutching my wrinkled hand. His face was a wreck of tears and disbelief. He was no longer the imposing Maestro Volkov. He was just Anton, the thin, angry boy with two big eyes who used to hide bread in his pockets. The entire ballroom was frozen. The silence was absolute. I lifted my free hand, the one he wasn't clinging to, and slowly, gently, placed it on his head, on his short, gray-streaked hair. "Hello, Anton," I said. My voice was quiet, but in the stillness, it carried. He let out a sharp, choked breath, a sound between a sob and a laugh. He squeezed my hand so tightly my bones ached. "Maestra Lara, it is you." He looked up, his eyes frantic. "But how?" They said you perished. In Warsaw, the fire at the old hall. They said you were gone. I searched. For 30 years, He couldn't finish the sentence. He bowed his head, pressing his face into my lap. "I did not perish, mój malchik," I said, using the old name. "My boy. I just stopped. I went away." From beside the piano, Julian Vale made a small, strangled sound. Anton's head snapped up. He seemed to have forgotten Julian, forgotten the entire room. Julian was staring, his face a mask of pale confusion and dawning, terrible understanding. "Maestra?" Julian's voice was a strained whisper. I don't understand." "Maestra Lara? As in, Lara Vance?" The name hung in the air. A woman at the front table gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A man nearby dropped his fork, which clattered loudly against his plate. A murmur started at the front of the room and spread like fire, a wave of whispers. "Lara Vance? The Lara Vance? It can't be. She's dead." Julian's eyes went wide. He looked at me, truly seeing me for the first time. The arrogance was gone, replaced by pure, unfiltered horror. "The ghost of the conservatoire?" He breathed. The one who wrote the Volkov technique?" He said the name as if it were a holy text. Hearing that, Anton stood up. His grief vanished, replaced by a cold, protective fury. He turned and faced Julian, his tall frame blocking me from the young man's view. His eyes were like ice. "The Volkov technique?" Anton scoffed. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was a clear, ringing baritone that filled the entire ballroom. "I only gave it that name because she refused to let me name it after her. Because she disappeared." He took a step toward Julian, who flinched. "This grandma," Anton said, his voice dripping with contempt. "This woman you just pushed off the piano bench." Another collective gasp went through the crowd. People were standing up at their tables to see. "This is Maestra Lara Vance," Anton declared. "She taught me to play when I was 12 years old in a Warsaw orphanage, on a piano with 10 broken keys. She taught me everything I know." He pointed a shaking finger at Julian. "And this simple song you mocked. It is the sparrow's lullaby. It is the foundational exercise of her method. The method you just butchered with your flashy, empty noise." Julian's face was no longer pale. It was a deep, burning, humiliated red. He opened his mouth, but only a small squeak came out. I didn't know." "No," Anton said, his voice low and dangerous. "You did not. You looked, but you did not see. You heard, but you did not listen." The silence that followed was heavy and complete. Julian looked as if he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him. Anton stared at him for one more cold second, then dismissed him. He turned his back on Julian completely. He faced me. All the hardness melted from his expression, replaced by that decades-old reverence, the look of the student who had finally found his master. He held out his arm to me. "Maestra," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Will you do me the honor?" He gestured to the piano, to the empty bench. "The piano. It has been waiting for you." My hand was still in Anton's. I looked at his outstretched arm, then at the polished black piano. It was the same piano that Julian had used to hammer out his noisy, empty performance. But now it looked different. It looked like it was mine. I let Anton help me up from the floor, though my legs were shaking so much I wasn't sure I could stand. He didn't lead me to the bench. He just supported me, his hand under my elbow as I took the few steps myself. Julian Vale was still standing there, a statue of humiliation. He looked at me, then at the piano, and in a jerky mechanical motion, he grabbed the bench and pulled it out for me. He was trying to apologize. I nodded, a small, tight dip of my chin. I sat. The keys were in front of me. 88 of them. My old world. My hands hovered over them, and the tremor was worse now. I was terrified. The silence from the crowd was a heavy weight. They were all watching me. This old woman in a funeral dress. This Maestra who had been declared a god by Anton Volkov. They were expecting a miracle. I could feel Anton's presence beside me. He wasn't sitting. He was standing just behind my right shoulder like a sentinel. I took a breath. I tried to block out the stares, the whispers, the weight of Anton's hope. I closed my eyes and went back to the only thing that made sense. I started with the lullaby. The first 5 notes, simple, clear. I played them the way they were meant to be played. Not as an exercise, but as a story. Each note had a purpose. Each space between the notes had meaning. The simple tune filled the vast, silent ballroom. The sound from the Bosendorfer was rich and warm, and it felt like my own voice, returned to me after a long sickness. I played the lullaby all the way through, my stiff fingers slowly uncurling. The pain in my knuckles seemed to fade, replaced by a different, older memory of movement. I could hear a woman in the front row quietly crying. I could see Julian out of the corner of my eye. He was watching my hands, his face pale, his mouth slightly open. He was not just looking, he was seeing. As the last note of the lullaby faded, I did not stop. My hands kept moving. The left hand found a new deep bass chord. The right hand began a new melody. It was a piece no one in this room except for me had ever heard. It was my own. The last thing I wrote before I walked away. My fingers, which had been so stiff, suddenly knew what to do. They found their old strength. They moved. They played fast runs that were not for show, but for feeling. They hit hard, powerful chords that spoke of anger and loss, and then they softened to notes so quiet you had to lean in to hear them. I was not playing for the gala. I was not playing for Anton. I was not playing to shame Julian. I was playing for myself. I was playing for the 30 years I had been silent. The music poured out of me. All the loneliness of the retirement home, all the grief for my lost life, all the sudden, sharp, aching joy of being found. The piano was not just an instrument. It was a part of me, a part I had cut off. And now it was back. The music swelled, filling the entire ballroom, climbing the high walls to the crystal chandeliers. It was a complex, difficult piece. I remembered my hands flying over the keys, my body strong. Now my body was old, but the music was timeless. I could feel Anton's breathing next to me. He was weeping, not small, quiet tears. He was crying openly, deep, shuddering breaths for all the world to see. I reached the end, the final chords. I built them up, loud and strong, a great wall of sound, and then I let it all resolve into one final, quiet, perfect chord. I held it. I let the sound hang in the air, vibrating. Then I lifted my hands. My hands dropped into my lap. They were shaking again, but not from age. From the work. The silence that followed was not like the silence before. It was not empty. It was full. It was heavy with everything that had just happened. No one moved. No one coughed. No one even seemed to breathe. The entire vast room was holding its breath. The silence stretched for 5 seconds. 10. From beside me, I heard Anton let out a long, shaky breath. "Ilara," he whispered, his voice completely broken. Anton's voice broke the stillness. He was the first. He didn't clap. He stepped in front of me, turned to face the stunned crowd, and simply opened his arms wide as if to present me. His face was a mess of tears, but he was smiling. A huge, brilliant, joyous smile. And then the room exploded. It was not the polite, scattered applause Julian had received. It was a roar. It started at the front tables and swept backward, a rising wave of sound. People were on their feet. Every single person in the ballroom was standing, their hands clapping, their faces turned to me. I looked at them. They were not looking at an old woman in a funeral dress anymore. They were not looking at Grandma. They were looking at the Maestra. I felt Anton's hand on my shoulder, a warm, steady pressure. He leaned down and spoke, his voice for my ears only. "Welcome back, Alara." I turned my head and saw Julian Vale. He had not moved. He was standing by the piano, his hands at his sides, his face pale. The applause was for me, not him. He was the one who was invisible now. He stepped forward, slowly. He stopped in front of me and Anton. He didn't speak for a moment, just looked at my hands, which were resting in my lap. Then he bowed. Not a flashy theatrical bow like he had done before. It was a deep, formal, and deeply humble bow from the waist. The kind of bow a student gives a master. "Maestra Vance," he said. His voice was low and he looked ashamed. I have no words. What I said, you did not know, I said. My voice was surprisingly steady. "I should have," he said, and the words were sharp with self-disgust. "I should have listened." He looked up and his eyes were clear. That was the greatest lesson I have ever had. Thank you." He then stepped back, out of the spotlight, and simply faded into the crowd. The applause was finally beginning to die down. People were still standing, watching. Anton never left my side. He took my hand and helped me to my feet, as if I were made of delicate glass. "Your coat," he said, his voice all business now. "Where is your coat?" I left it at my table," I said, dazed. "Table 42. "No," Anton said, a new firmness in his voice. He slipped his own suit jacket off his shoulders. It was warm. He draped it over my shoulders. It was huge on me, and it smelled of him, a faint scent of starch and clean wool. "You are not going back to table 42, he said. He tucked my arm securely in his. "You are coming with me." He turned and led me off the stage. He did not lead me toward the back. He led me straight down the center aisle, through the heart of the gala. The crowd parted for us. People who had looked right through me hours earlier now watched me with expressions of awe and respect. They stepped aside, clearing a path. I heard my name whispered as we passed. Alara Vance. It's really her. I held my head high. My back was straight. My hand was on Anton's arm. We reached the grand lobby, the marble floors, and the heavy glass doors. A valet rushed to open them. The cold night air hit my face. Anton didn't stop. He led me down the steps, right to a long black car that was waiting at the curb. The driver was already holding the door. Anton helped me in carefully, then slid in beside me. He said a single word to the driver, and the car pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the lights and the noise of the Grand Mark Hotel behind. We sat in silence for a moment, the city lights sliding past the window. My hands were resting on my lap over Anton's warm jacket. The tremor was gone. They were completely, perfectly still. "So," Anton said, his voice soft in the darkness of the car. He reached over and took my hand. "Where to, Maestra? My home is your home. You are never going back to that place." I looked at our joined hands. His, strong and famous. Mine, old and spotted. Together they made sense. Just drive for a minute, Anton, I said, my voice quiet. I want to see the city. I leaned my head back against the seat. I was tired, but it was a good tired. It was the best kind of tired. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 30 years I was not a ghost. I was Alara,